Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone, and welcome to this webinar titled FDA Guidance Documents, Shaping the Future of RWD Curation and RWE Innovation. This webinar has been sponsored by IQVIA, so a huge thank you to them for helping to make this event possible. I'm Sydney Menson from the events team at scientist.com, and I'm happy to be your host for today's event. IQVIA is a leading global provider of advanced analytics, technology solutions, and clinical research services to the life sciences industry. IQVIA creates intelligent connections to deliver powerful insights with speed and agility, accelerating the clinical development and commercialization of innovative medical treatments that improve healthcare outcomes for patients. IQVIA Real-World Solutions regulatory and payer expertise spans across therapeutic areas on global, regional, and local levels, generating real-world evidence to meet challenges specific to regulatory jurisdictions and to demonstrate the value and effectiveness of products. I'd like to welcome our two speakers from IQVIA, Raina Olexa and Mui Van Zandt. Raina has over 20 years of medical research and pharmaceutical expertise, working across all stages of the product life cycle. She conducted preclinical neurobiology research to assess recovery of function in animal models of spinal cord injury before moving into the field of vaccine and biologics manufacturing. Mui Van Zandt is an experienced in systems and application development, focusing on business analysis and project management. Her duties have spanned the spectrum of the system lifecycle, from initial concept definition, analysis, design, testing, and implementation to operations and maintenance. And now I would like to introduce Raina. Thanks for joining.
Thanks.
Please take it away whenever you're ready.
Thank you so much, Sydney. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I'm happy to be here with Mui to take you through some of the guidance documents and some of the changes that have happened recently, particularly in this real-world space. So as we're looking at this first slide and the evolving evidentiary landscape, some of this should look very familiar to you. We do have the product life cycle here from preclinical, phase 1 through 3, to the submissions, as well as the approval, getting into that reimbursement cycle, as well as the phase 4 piece. And from a reimbursement standpoint, what we end up seeing is this is becoming affectionately referred to as phase 5 of this product development life cycle. I think historically what many of us had thought about was that real-world evidence and real-world data would play more of a part from approval forward. So looking at that phase 3B, phase 4, and anything into the reimbursement cycle. But really what we're seeing today is that real-world evidence and real-world data can be leveraged throughout this product development life cycle, even within early development. Looking at evidence planning, data strategy plans, taking a look at external comparators, validating biomarkers, using disease registry data to influence early development and early planning of the product. You can also utilize regulatory intelligence to inform indication and dosage strategies for later development efforts. And then, of course, we have what we would have considered the traditional RWE space in that post-approval cycle, looking for the demonstration of value and differentiation, perhaps looking at a label expansion, safety and effectiveness, any type of patient-reported outcomes or implications coming from a rare disease, whether that be registry or feeding recruitment for earlier phases of the cycle. In order to achieve this, we do have these days an impressive array of growing and real-world sources. So here on the left-hand side of the screen, just to orient you to what the definitions are that the FDA has categorized as real-world data versus real-world evidence. So real-world data is data relating to patient health status or the delivery of healthcare that can be collected from a variety of sources. And you can see here on the spectrum what some of those sources have turned into, whether we're talking about health insurance and claims data, mortality data, social media data has become an increasing force here as well. Looking at electronic medical records, clinical outcome assessments, any patient-reported outcomes, wearables, as well as registries. And so the sources of this real-world data can be utilized then to influence real-world evidence, which is the clinical evidence about the usage and the potential benefits or risks of a medical product that's derived from the analysis of these real-world data. So as we alluded to before, real-world evidence can drive ROI throughout that product development lifecycle. It can inform the strategy using real-world data to understand the unmet medical needs, any patient subgroups. It can inform strategic decision-making in order to maximize the value of your assets. It can enhance clinical development, accelerating and optimizing clinical trials, whether we're looking at feasibility, smarter study designs, faster recruitment rates, or establishing clinical trial endpoints. And that has a benefit of a timeline acceleration as well as cost savings. We do see a lot of label expansions and approvals in this real-world space using real-world evidence for registration and label expansions. There have been several instances where not only IQVIA, but other areas have been successful in having label expansions or indication expansions utilizing real-world evidence and real-world data. And again, this has a timeline and cost acceleration associated with it as well. With regard to health technology assessments and market access, we can use real-world evidence in HTA submissions to accelerate and improve access and improve the pricing or to get a premium price with the market access. Again, this has a potential for a higher price from a market aspect, a higher probability for success, potential for broader patient access, as well as increased market potential. From the standpoint of post-approval, we do have value demonstration and differentiation, utilizing real-world evidence to demonstrate that comparative advantage and value, being a bit smarter and faster and leaner with regard to post-approval study designs, and using real-world evidence to inform clinical guidelines and to measure adherence. Once again, we may see a cost savings benefit, an increased ROI, and the increased market potential. And then finally, with regard to optimizing care pathways, we can use real-world evidence to streamline patient journeys and support precision diagnoses, ultimately improving patient outcomes. Faster product uptake and increased market potential are some of the benefits from utilizing real-world data and real-world evidence in this manner. Now, regulators are increasingly interested in how real-world evidence can support regulatory decision-making, and we'll talk quite a bit more about this as we move forward in the presentation. But taking a look at our traditional randomized controlled trials, despite the challenges, traditional RCTs are still considered to be the gold standard for drug evidence as well as approval and development. But RCTs can be increasingly time and resource intensive. They are not broadly representative of patients that are seen in actual clinical care. So for example, when you consider the inclusion and exclusion criteria that you utilize with regard to an RCT, you're looking at a very homogeneous population. When you expand beyond and you begin to use the real-world data and the real-world evidence based upon the patients that we see in actual clinical care, you will get a more homogeneous representation of the actual population that you can utilize to make informed decisions. In some instances, it may be unethical or infeasible to perform an RCT on a certain patient population. Considering rare disease, for example, there may not be enough patients available to really flesh out and develop a traditional RCT, or in certain situations such as oncology trials, it may not be ethical or feasible in order to provide or have an oncology trial have the information where the patients receive placebo. With regard to real-world data and real-world evidence, we can use that to demonstrate medical product safety and effectiveness. So real-world evidence, as we discussed, does reflect a broader patient population, and the RCTs may not be generating endpoints that are truly useful for patients, providers, or payers. So we can fill the remaining downstream evidence gaps that you may not be able to achieve by utilizing a traditional RCT. Real-world data can also be used to improve the efficiency of clinical research. So the growing base of real-world data from the electronic health information and the infrastructure, as many of you are familiar with, as we saw from the poll, have enabled routine and increasingly robust collection of digital data at the point of patient care. Before we get into additional information with regard to what the U.S. Food and Drug Administration has done, we did want to make you aware that there has been progress internationally on an RWE scale. So with regard to the European Union, we do have the Darwin EU Vision Statement, where the European Union would like to expand its use of real-world evidence and real-world data, really for the safety and the effectiveness of medicines, including vaccines, taking a look at the trustworthy and the trustworthy real-world evidence for examples on disease and patient populations. In China, we also have a few guidance documents that were recently released with regard to using real-world data and generating RWE. So there is an increased trend in acceptance from the Chinese government with regard to real-world evidence. You do see the same thing in Japan and India as well, describing principles on the utilization of registry for applications in Japan. Again, getting into that overall increased trend of how can we use claims and EHR data networks in order to influence that product development lifecycle. And finally, from an ICH perspective, we do have the guidance documents on the planning and designing of pharmacoepidemiological studies in order to maximize RWD for the safety assessments. In addition to that, the ICH renovation that they've been talking about doing for quite some time would have appendices added to ICH E6 in order to talk about non-traditional study designs. What are the requirements for those? And really from that non-traditional study design perspective, we are looking more into that real-world data, real-world evidence space. So definitely keep an eye out for that in the future. Now, as we talk a little bit more specifically with regard to the United States, this is a very brief timeline of some of the activities that have gone on from a U.S. FDA perspective. In 2016, the 21st Century Cures Act became law in the United States, and this was really the impetus that spurred the remainder of the information that you see on this timeline, as well as the information that we're going to talk about a little bit more detail later today. The 21st Century Cures Act did a lot of things and broadened out really to accelerate the drug development lifecycle. And as part of that, real-world evidence and real-world data were considered as potential tools in order to accelerate and help flesh out what we can do with the drug development lifecycle. One of the biggest things that the 21st Century Cures Act had done with regard to real-world data and real-world evidence was it actually added a Section 505F to the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, which ultimately set the stage for the United States government and the FDA to implement a real-world evidence program, as well as mitigated or decided to do some additional guidance documents in order to support that effort. So we do have some additional guidance that had been issued out prior to that. We do have the real-world evidence to support regulatory decision-making for medical devices, and that became final in 2017. CDRH was actually at the forefront of utilizing real-world data and real-world evidence for the regulatory spectrum from a medical device perspective. We have the EHR data in clinical investigations, as well as the fundamental framework for the FDA's real-world evidence program. Now, this was issued in 2019, and as we can see, following on from that, we do have some additional guidance documents to flesh out and continue building upon the FDA's real-world evidence program. 2021 was a particularly busy year with regard to these guidance documents. You can see that we have issued 4 guidance documents, all in a flurry towards the end of the year, and we'll be talking a little bit more about these in detail. So if we take a look at the last 4 that were issued in 2021, from September through December, there were actually a flurry of guidance documents that the FDA had issued, again, in order to flesh out, meet the requirements of the 21st Century Cures Act, and meet the requirements of fleshing out that real-world evidence program for the FDA. So in September, we had a guidance document issued on assessing EHR and medical claims data to support regulatory decision-making for drug and biologic products. So now we're delving in and we're taking that a step forward, looking at the drug and development life cycle in addition to what the FDA had already done historically from a medical device perspective. This particular guidance document proposes how to appropriately select EHR and claims data sources, how to develop and validate definitions for study design elements, and how to evaluate data quality throughout the course of that life cycle. It provides recommendations on issues such as data capture, how to handle missing data, and the use of unstructured data, and taking a look at data linkage and synthesis. The next month, we had another guidance document issued for data standards for drug and biologic product submissions, outlining the preliminary considerations for various regulatory submissions that do contain real-world data. It provided key terminology and mapping criteria in order to map what we would see from a real-world perspective to that traditional gold standard RCT data. In November, we had the guidance document on assessing registries to support regulatory decision-making, which really defined the FDA's current approach in assessing a registry as fit for purpose to support regulatory decisions. So that lays out some key elements for the demographic, the clinical, the treatment, and health-related outcomes. And then finally, in December, we had the considerations document for the use of RWD and RWE to support regulatory decision-making, again, for drug and biologic products, highlighting the need for sponsors to really fine-tune and identify what real-world data and real-world evidence study requirements would be at early stages of the development to ensure that the studies are well-designed and would comply with regulatory standards. This particular guidance document stresses the need for product-specific guidance for key disease areas or serious conditions. So let's take a moment for these last 2 guidance documents and take a little bit of a deeper dive into the most recent 2 that were issued. With regard to assessing registries to support regulatory decisions, this particular guidance document is kind of broken down into 3 key areas: relevance, reliability, as well as data elements. So in terms of relevance, you will see this theme throughout the guidance documents. We'll also talk a little bit about this with regard to the next guidance document that we delve into. But really, at the end of the day, the question is, are your data going to support the scientific objectives of the study? So with regard to registries, we're looking at whether the registry data is adequate for evaluating the scientific objectives of the study. With regard to demographic or clinical information, any treatment or pregnancy-related information, what is your ultimate research question? And does the registry data that you have available to you adequately address that question? There's been a lot of conversations with regard to reliability of real-world data. Historically, people thought that it was a little bit unstructured, a little bit more difficult to work with, and perhaps not as reliable as it should be in order to compare it to traditional RCTs. So really what this guidance document is advocating for is establishing a governance process for registry operations, not only to verify the data accuracy and completeness of the data, but to have provenance and traceability. So what they suggest is having a data dictionary and validated queries and edit checks, defined processes for the collection, curation, management, and storage of these data, considerations put into place for how the end user will not only access, but interact with the data. Terms and conditions for use of the registry data, who can use it, who can see it, how can it be accessed, and conformance, where applicable, to 21 CFR Part 11, having audit trails in order to demonstrate the provenance and the traceability of these data. With regard to data elements, we're looking at the utilization of common data elements to promote that standardized, consistent, and universal data collection. The FDA would like it to be ideally consistent with those data standards that they are familiar with. And of course, data management strategies in order to support that data assurance. And when we look at the considerations document, the one that was issued in December for regulatory decision-making of drugs and biologic products, it does call out some of the line items that we talked about earlier, the potential utility of using real-world data, even in interventional studies. So it has the potential to help you identify potential participants for RCT. It can be used as a comparator arm, and it can also be utilized to ascertain endpoints or outcomes. Now, this guidance document does go into a lot more detail with regard to how you would evaluate those data sources for design and feasibility. So this is where the FDA really wants you to take a look proactively, early as possible in the development lifecycle. Where do you think that you're going to get these data from? Again, going back to that concept of, does it answer your research question? And how would you include or exclude these pieces of data? So does the data address the research question? You can see as a common theme across several of these guidance documents. The estimation of statistical precision of the study without evaluating outcomes. Again, taking a really good look at what the data sources are and providing justification for what data points you selected versus those you have excluded. Really having a fine-tuned analysis during that design phase, aligning the data to the research question, providing that documentation and that justification on what you did or did not select very early on. Taking a look at the patient characteristics of the source population that you are looking for. And if the data is derived from third parties, there should be agreements for the FDA to permit inspection. So if you are purchasing this data from another third-party company, what they would like to see is there being some sort of agreement that indicates that during an inspection scenario, the FDA will actually have ready access to these data should they need it. They also advocate for transparency by posting the protocols and any other results to clinicaltrials.gov and or NCEPT. And really the crux of this particular guidance document is to maintain the reliability of real-world data and data integrity from the point of origin through curation, transformation, and reporting of results. They talk about having a risk-based QMS, how this can be utilized for safety reporting, as well as ICH considerations. So with regard to how you would curate, transform, and report the results, I'm actually going to hand it over to my colleague Mui, who will take you through a little bit more information with regard to data standards and how you can operationalize that.
Thank you, Raina. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. It's an honor to be here. Like Raina talked about in the FDA guidance, right? How do you then go and answer a lot of those questions that's in the FDA guidance, such as, is this data asset reliable? How do I know, right? Transparency amongst those different data assets that you have. So what I'm going to walk through with you today are two different topics. One is first data standardization, and then data quality that you want to be able to apply on top of the data that you have. So within data standardization, most of us, as you shown us in your poll earlier, that you realize that there are a lot of different data assets out there, and you're familiar with many of these different data assets. But as we continue down the digital age, there's more and more data that's going to be available to us, as well as they're all in many different types of formats and many different types of fields, many different types of curation problems, many different types of privacy problems that you might encounter. But the vast majority of this data is so rich that we want to be able to use them for key insights, such as understanding your cohort, your patient population, being able to characterize them, being able to do different types of analytics on top of them, not only for FDA, but for other pharma as well as other medical related research questions, right? But how do you do this? How are you able to get and curate and get that information, pull that information out of all these different data assets that you have? Well, with that, you slowly need the increase of a better data quality standard. But before you can get to a better data quality standard, maybe we need a better data quality, data standardization. Okay, so data standardization, right? What does that mean? Typically, that means a common data model, trying to take all those data assets that you just saw earlier and putting them into a common data model. But I'm sure you've heard of many of these common data models that are out there. And what you see on this list is really a comparison of some of these different data models and what they're capable of, not only from a complexity on their data management, but also on their analysis and the use cases that they're able to cover. So when we look at all these different models, we start thinking as a company, which one is the best one for us to utilize and why, right? So if you look on these y-axis here, it's about the data management complexity, and then on the x-axis, it's about the complexity of the analytics for the analysts themselves, right? So you have I2B2, you have Sentinel, you have FHIR, you have Coronet, you have all these different data models that are out there, but they all were built for different purposes. And really, you have to figure out which one's the best suited for you, because some of them, like the I2B2 one, has the common protocol as well as the common structure. And that's the same thing with the FHIR one. But then some of them goes a little bit above and beyond that because their usage is a little different. FHIR was used really created for data transformation around EHRs. So therefore, they didn't really build in a lot of standard conventions, whereas Coronet and Sentinel, they were more used for submissions and actually use cases, right? While on the highest level one you see there also has common vocabularies, which is the Odyssey and the Jabra, which they decided to go take not only your common conventions, but a level above that to standardize and harmonize all the ontology that exists within the common data model. So, and then because of that reason, these models were built to cover different use cases. As you can see on the right-hand side here, we have those that were built to do cohort definition, clinical characterizations, but then others were built to be able to do much more in-depth analysis, such as patient prediction models, as well as population level estimations. So really, you see all these different models, and you have to think about what is it that our organization should use and when. But then the other thing you think about is, why can't all of these guys work with each other? Because if they're able to work with each other, then we can make it a lot more interoperable, right? Because maybe my organization sits on one, but my companion's organization sits on another one. Well, there are actually organizations that are working together to actually make their models a lot more interoperable with each other. Last year, HL7 and Odyssey actually announced the collaboration effort to provide a single common data model for sharing information in clinical care and observational research. This project kicked off around November of last year, and right now they are working through how to create this common single data model that can be used between both the Odyssey OMOP model and the FHIR HL7 model. Now, again, all organizations, we have to go and say which one is the best suited for us. So IQVIA actually has gone and adapted the Odyssey OMOP model based on the use cases as well as the standardization and harmonization levels that it actually gets into, because we have a lot of data assets, both EHR, EMR, claims, registries across the globe. So in order to ensure that they are all interoperable and be able to work with each other, we chose the most complex model to use to implement, because it harmonizes not only the model itself, but it actually does go through and ensures that all of our ontology and medical coding systems actually align to each other and harmonize into one single source of truth. So as you can see here, we actually have gone through and done a lot of these on 15 different data assets that we currently host. We've done it to both internal and external conversion data assets, as well as 10 different countries and 5 different continents. So that was really about data quality, or I'm sorry, data standardization, and how we utilize look at different data models and putting your data into that type of data, right? Some of the stuff that people ask me is maybe what are some of the most common issues that I run across when I'm trying to do these conversions, right? One of them, of course, is data quality issues. Now, how do you define these data quality issues? And how do we go and make these more transparent so that we can actually meet those FDA guidelines that Raina just talked about? So here I'm going to go a bit into what are some of those problems, as well as what are some of the answers to those problems and how did we address them. Okay. Now, before I talk about some of those problems, I want to introduce to you a data quality framework that actually exists out there that we have adapted. We coin it the CON framework. It's actually based on a publication that Michael Kahn from the University of Colorado published. And what they did in this publication is they identified what the challenge was around data quality, not only on a common data model, but in any data, right? Regardless of if it's common or not. It was very difficult. So their challenges really was it's very difficult to compare the results across multiple data assets. Really difficult to understand when similar or different data quality features was discussed, and a lack of transparency. Right? I'm sure you guys have the same challenges too. When you actually go into a data asset, you go, how do I know that this data asset answers my question fully? Or how did they really curate and manage this data to begin with? Can I see some of those data quality checks? Can I trust those data quality checks? Right? So those are many of the same challenges that we all face. And what the objective of this paper was to do is try to harmonize all these different data quality assessment terms, methods, and reporting practice so that everybody, just like a common data model, had a very standardized and common way of reporting data quality out. Okay, in the process in which they did this was they looked at quite a few different areas where data quality already existed and went through those and picked the best practices out of all of that. So they went through the Mini Sentinel data characterization routine. In the Odyssey community, there were open source already a bunch of rules that tested data quality based on the standardized data model. They also looked at their own standardized operating procedures and from past and current projects, and they also went through best practices and data quality publications from 20 plus different data research networks. So what was the outcome of all this? The outcome of all this is the data quality framework that was built on 2 categories and then multiple subcategories. So the 2 different categories was conformance and completeness. So conformance is really around, does my data value adhere to a specific standard and format? While completeness talks about how complete is my data? Is there enough data presence for any field or for any of my tables that exist, right? And within those, you have different subcategories: plausibility, verification, and validation. So plausibility really is, are my data values believable? For example, if a patient has prostate cancer, then the the patient should be a male, right? If they're not, then is that data believable at that point in time? Is that particular patient record believable? Right? Verification goes down, do my data elements match expectations with respect to metadata, constraints, system constraints, or local knowledge? Right? So if I have a code, does that code actually exist? If I have an ICD-10 code, does that code actually exist? If it doesn't, then how, again, believable and how complete is the data that I have? Right? Validation, does the data values align with respect of external benchmarkers? So you're not only looking at your own data asset, but comparing it to potentially national benchmarks or other networks benchmarks. Does your data align with all those other benchmarks that are outside? When you do a sniff test, does it live up to that sniff testing? Now, you see all of these framework and you're thinking, this is great, but how do I actually utilize all these concepts and all of these principles in an actual reality? How do I implement this, right? So what we've developed in conjunction with the Odyssey community is a data quality dashboard, short DQD, right? It was actually developed by Odyssey in 2019. IQVIA played a very core part of this development. It follows the COM framework, and because the OMOP model is standardized, we're able to apply this to any data asset that sits on top of OMOP, and there is over 3,000 plus checks. Okay, and you can execute this at any time you actually refresh the data. This is actually used by quite a few people out there, lots of different pharma companies, a lot of different academic institutions that has their data on OMOP utilizes this. The FDA actually utilizes this to look at the data assets that they are using. They ask for these quality checks to say, hey, can you tell me how good is your data so that I can better assess whether or not I should use this data for my research question, or so that I can understand and identify what are the constraints that I need to be aware of when I'm doing this research question on this data asset. I do want to put the caveat out there that this is a data quality report. It doesn't mean that everything on here is going to pass, right? The whole purpose of this report is to identify the elements that may or may not pass so that a researcher can better understand what they are utilizing. And they are the ones that make the decision whether or not to utilize this data asset or understand the constraints. Right? If you can fix everything, that's great. But in reality, to fix something to be 100% takes a lot of time and probably not economically feasible for most companies. So what I'm going to show you next is actually a demo of how this tool works on top of different data assets. I'm going to show you two of the 15 data assets that I showed earlier that has this tool on top of it already.
Now I'm going to show you what the data quality dashboard actually looks like. You can see over here, this was actually executed on IQVIA's Pharmetrics Plus, which is a claims database. It was ran about 2 months ago when we actually did a refresh on this data. And as you can see from this table, it actually runs through all the verification and validation checks that was defined in the CON framework. As part of that, we also broke it down by the subcategories of plausibility, conformance, and completeness. And overall, we ran about 3,300 tests, and of those, 9 of them failed. Now, this data asset, because it's claims, it's probably a bit cleaner when it comes to the actual dirtiness of the data. So if we go down a little bit, right, and if you didn't know anything about this data asset, the data source metadata will give you a little bit of insights of that. So this particular data asset is from 2006 to 2021. thus far. And it comprises of fully adjudicated medical and pharmacy claims. It's longitudinal. It has prescriptions, inpatient, outpatient, drugs, cost enrollment, like yada, yada, yada. Okay. It also tells you a bit about the data model that we used and the version that we actually used. So this is the OMOP CDM v5.3.1. And it was and this actual data was released on March 30th, 2022. Okay, as well as the vocabulary, and it gives us where we actually put our ETL specifications for this actual curation process. Now, if I go down a bit more, we get to see the results. Let me switch this out. If we go here, you can see all the actual pass and as failed, right? It breaks down quite a bit. So here you can actually filter by pass. And if we want to go to see the verifications that pass, these are all the verification tables that pass. These are all the completeness ones that pass. And then the subcategory even further down. We can keep going, keep going, keep going. So you can see here that we actually didn't test anything for validation, completeness, and atemporal. Okay. But computational, we didn't either. But relational, we might have tested a bunch. Right? Sorry about that. Go back here. So you can see we just keep going. There's a few things I want to make sure you understand. Over here, it actually tells you what the rule is that we actually tested, right? So in this one, the number and percentage of person in the database that do not have at least one record in the note table. So 100% of them basically have it. And then what you can also see is actually the query that was used to run this particular check to ensure that it passed or failed. So now let's look at some of the ones that failed, okay? Let me get rid of all these. And you can see of all the ones that failed, if I picked on validation, right? You can see these are atemporal validations. Let's just say, for example, this first one, for this particular code that we have here, the number of records should be associated with male. So here we're saying there's a bunch of improbable gender in here. So 12.8% of the records that sits in here with this particular medical code seems to not be tied to male. Reason for that, probably the insurance came over and it was unknown, or someone coded it incorrectly to a female. So what we would do then is go back and check on that and see whether or not that's true or false, right? And you can keep going and you can see these are some of the atemporal checks that we do. So this is another code for male, and the percentage is a little bit higher than what we defined as the threshold. You can define the threshold as whatever you want, but we particularly within our group, we've defined it as 5%. We want to make sure we don't have that many incorrect ones. Okay. Now let me go to another database, right? So another data asset. This is our ambulatory EMR database. And you can see here, same thing, exactly same structure. Now this one, there's a little bit more failures. So there's 241 failures here, right? So what is ambulatory EMR? It is really our ambulatory primary care EMR database, okay? Now, again, if I come down here and look at the status, you can see all the fails and passes. So let's now look at some of the things that failed, right? So here, it's the same thing. We have some atemporal checks that's checking that certain measurements has to be within a value, within a percentage or within a number, right? So that's what these things check. And if we look at some of the other ones, let's just say that validation here, again, you'll see some of the similar stuff. Let's look at maybe completeness or conformance. Looks like we just have a bunch of possibility checks that failed, okay? And if we look at verification, it looks like it's the same thing, a bunch of possibilities that failed. Now, if I keep going, you'll see there's quite a few of these that potentially have failed. And what we do, again, is we would go back to the data and look at it and see whether or not we can fix it, right? If we can, then we'll fix it. If we can't, then at least we know that there's a certain percentage of the data that failed.
All right, thank you. With that, I'm going to hand it back over to Raina.
Great. Thank you, Mui. So when we talk about potential solutions that not only IQVIA can provide, but what might be out there on the marketplace, let's take a little bit of a look at what is available. First of all, we wanted to point out that regulators do tend to rely on IQVIA guidance. In the upper corner of this slide, you will see several publications that IQVIA staff have written, whether it pertains to registries and textbooks on how to operationalize registries, or just journal articles with regard to how do you advance the framework for regulatory use in this space. And several of these IQVIA publications have been cross-referenced within the guidance documents, some of which that we've talked about today, with regard to the draft guidance for industry, not only from an FDA, but an EMA, as well as the National Medical Products Administration for China. In addition to that, IQVIA was a founding member of the RWE Alliance, which is a coalition to advance U.S. policies that support regulatory use of real-world evidence. So our mission is to advocate jointly for policies that encourage the use of real-world evidence for regulatory decisions regarding medical products. And we envision a future where RWD is generated in everyday clinical practice that we can utilize to support regulatory decision-making. We do want to make sure that the policies and the draft guidance documents that are issued are feasible, practicable, and informed by our direct and broad experience in how we aggregate and generate RWE. When we talk about some of the solutions that we do have available, we have regulatory science and strategy that really spans the breadth of how do you translate and interpret several of these guidance documents and the regulatory framework. So from a regulatory strategy perspective, we want to optimize those regulatory outcomes, mitigating risk with holistic and tailored approaches, looking to increase agility through that early engagement. From an evidence planning perspective, we want to identify holistic and relevant evidence needs, developing data strategies that are going to maximize the utility of evidence generation and addressing any cross-functional requirements with a feasible innovation. With regard to regulatory science, we are wanting to advance the use of innovations for regulated products, looking at the validation of new data methods and tools, addressing those gaps to identify opportunities. And with regard to regulatory intelligence, which I have to admit I'm a bit biased on with regard to all of these, I feel that this is strategically important, staying informed of the rapidly evolving regulatory environment. I'm sure you've noticed just as much as we have noticed here at IQVIA that in the past year or two, we've seen an increase in the changes in legislation, the changes with guidance documents being issued. Not only did we have the medical device directive, the clinical trial directive, we have all of the new RWE guidances coming out. So this is really an interesting time from a regulatory perspective, where things had kind of been stagnant for the last 20, even potentially 30 years. And now we're seeing things being revised, being updated, accounting for the changes in technology, and accounting for some of the other aspects that can really influence that decision making. With regard to OMOP standardization and data quality, Mui and her team are the data gurus here at IQVIA, and they can provide training and have high experienced trainers, not only with the OMOP and CDM vocabulary. They conduct conversion workshops, standard analytics training. They can perform OMOP conversions, doing the high quality data mapping from those sources with software to assist with that conversion, and again, a team with high expertise to ensure accurate data mapping. As Mui discussed with regard to the CON framework, there are data quality workshops for the evaluation of data quality issues and discussion of probable solutions and resolution of any gaps or issues identified, as well as that SME support, being an industry-leading team of experts to assist with the evaluation of those gaps and any issues that you might encounter with standardization, defining and evaluating any potential mitigation strategies. So finally, we would like to thank you for joining us today. With regard to the key objectives that we had, we wanted to talk about and discover the big picture of the FDA's 2021 real-world guidelines, understand what some of those common data quality challenges are, how you can overcome those issues, and how you can apply that data quality concept in your organization. Learn how the data quality measures can help improve transparency for better research, and discover systematic approaches to monitor data quality that have been implemented across IQVIA as well as several other sources of global data.
Okay, let's get started. First question here. Will IQVIA interpret the FDA guidance documents once the final rulings are released?
Yes, absolutely. That is one of the core fundamental things that we do from a regulatory science and a strategy perspective. We've actually even started doing that with the draft guidance documents as well. So when the FDA issues any type of guidance or any preliminary rulemaking, they do publish it in the Federal Register, and there is a comment period associated with it. So not only within IQVIA have we worked internally, but we've also worked with our partners on the RWE Alliance to kind of dissect those guidance documents, provide any commentary for additional clarification on how we can operationalize that. And then certainly once those guidance documents become final, or once any legislation becomes final, really what my team does from a regulatory science and strategy perspective is we do a deep dive into that. How do you operationalize that? You know, the guidance document or the regulation will say X in black and white, but sometimes there's pieces missing out of that with regard to how you would ultimately take that, translate that requirement, and operationalize it at the end of the day.
Great response. Thank you so much. Okay, our next question is, what are some of the most common data quality problems you have come across in helping clients identify data quality problems and resolve them?
I'll take that one. There's actually quite a bit, right? When we talked earlier, right, completeness as well as the validity of the data. There's a lot of those issues, and what we typically do with our services is we can run a lot of different type of analytics on the data to better understand what is missing and what needs to be corrected, or even if you have a lot of text fields in your data, which typically happens with EMRs or EHRs because there's a lot of notes. We actually have NLP solutions that we can put on top of it that will be able to mine out all that text and give back actual terms instead of just a bunch of text. So it can actually help structure a lot of that data.
That was fantastic. Thank you. Okay, and with that, I think we're going to close it out here. Thank you both so much for sharing your knowledge and taking the time to be here today. It really was a pleasure to have you with us.
Thanks for having us. Thanks for sticking around. We appreciate it.
Great. And a big thanks also to the audience here for participating. And last but not least, we'd like to thank the sponsor, IQVIA. In closing, we hope you enjoyed this webinar, and we look forward to having you with us again soon.